All right, welcome to Religion 3367, Islamic Faith and Society. This also will be a kind of combined lecture, or a two lectures in one, if you like, devoted to the Qur'an, the Holy Qur'an, the sacred text, the religious scripture of the religion of Islam. This two-in-one lecture covers the rather substantial chapter 5, which is entitled simply the Qur'an. So there is some discussion here of what he calls the Qur'an in modern imagination. Then he moves to something called the history of texts. There's a little box on page 81 called early manuscripts and palimpsests. He talks about the language of the Qur'an, the context, Jesus in the Qur'an, Qur'an and Muslim piety, eternity of the Qur'an, inimitability, interpretation, central themes, narratives, Qur'an, Sirah. So there's a lot going on here. Most of this you can read. I am mainly going to focus on the beginning part, the topics raised in the beginning sections, namely pages from the first page of the chapter, which begins on 77 up to about, I would say about, what is it, page 87 or 88 or so, the topics that are contained therein. These topics really have to do with the Qur'an as a text and the textual history, if you like, the the transmission history also, if you like, of the Qur'an. And before we'll just start from the very beginning. Under the Qur'an in modern imagination, he refers to an article which appeared in 1999 in the Atlantic Monthly. The Atlantic Monthly, back in those days, people still read printed magazines. It's all pretty much online now. I remember when this happened. This was 1999, so it's more than 20 years ago, 23, 24 years ago that this article came out. The Atlantic Monthly is a conservative or neoconservative kind of magazine. Neoconservatives have typically not been very favorable to Muslims or any other so-called minorities or what have you. And this article was written by a complete unknown journalist by the name of Toby Lester. And I remember when this article came out because he did interview certain people whom I know personally. One of those was, or at least he was quoted, so I assume Toby went and saw him. I never spoke to him, but one of those people in question is Michael Cook. Michael Cook is still alive. He was one of my professors at Princeton University. I learned a great deal from him, although I disagree with almost everything he has written or stands for. The Atlantic Monthly article was entitled, "What is the Quran?" with a K. That's an older spelling. I mean, these are matters of convention. Nowadays, the more acceptable spelling is Qur, and there's usually like an apostrophe and then a line over the A-N to more accurately sort of represent the sounds in Arabic, Qur'an, as opposed to Quran. At any rate, Lester referred to certain archaeological findings or discoveries. There was a cache of manuscripts that first came to light in 1972 in Yemen during the renovation of a mosque in Sana'a in Yemen. And the manuscripts that emerged from that are known as the Sana'a manuscripts or the Sana'a palimpsests. Now, a palimpsest, what a palimpsest is discussed also in the box on page 81 under early manuscripts and palimpsests. A palimpsest is a manuscript. So you have to remember that early books or books in the pre-modern period all over the world, but certainly in the Islamic world until much later than in the Western world, were written by hand, and these are manuscript works. And so I don't know if I have any examples of manuscripts here. I don't in this room. I have them in a secure location. But if you're interested in Arabic manuscripts, if you watch the video on my YouTube channel called My Library, in fact, it's the actual what do you call it? The actual, advertisement video or whatever it is. If you go on the actual channel page, you'll see it's there. So you can see what Arabic manuscripts look like. But typically Arabic manuscripts were, in the early days, earliest period, written on parchment. Parchment is a kind of animal skin. And paper was in scarce and short supply, or not available at all, especially in the early periods. Thereafter, paper making was refined to a very high art in the Islamic world, but even then people wanted to be careful with paper. But in the case of parchment you can write on with an ink, and the inks that were used were often what you call gum inks, meaning there would be some sort of a pigment and there would be some sort of sticky thing, and so really the writing would literally be glued to the surface, and you could actually scrape that off, and while it was still wet you could just wipe it off, and then you could even wash it off. So palimpsest is a kind of manuscript in which the original writing has been scraped or washed away and written over. And underneath, sometimes you can still see the traces of the earlier writing, and especially with modern techniques, about which I don't know a lot, maybe. I think it involves special kinds of lighting. I don't want to necessarily say whether it's infrared or what kind of lighting, but suffice it to say, subjected to certain spectrum of light, you can read what's underneath, or what had originally been there, to a great deal, to a great extent. And so these manuscripts, which came to light in 1972, the Sana'a palimpsests, were studied for a very long time. The Yemeni government didn't really have the resources for this, and so they brought in some experts on what's called manuscripts and codicology, the science of ancient sort of writing and manuscripts, from what was then East Germany. And there was a professor by the name of Gerd Puin from the University of the Saarland in East Germany at the time. And he did some research on these things. And it wasn't really until much later, where did the article go? Oh, where's the book? Until much later that these findings sort of came to light in the public, around the time that Lester prepared this article. And Gerd Puin, or actually Gerd it should be Gerhard, but Gerd I think is abbreviation. Gerhard Puin made a number of startling claims. I'm quoting here. Puin, and I quote, this is from page 77. Puin hinted that the manuscripts which contained the oldest fragments of the Quran ever found might overturn traditional ideas about the origins of the Quran, and he insinuated that the evidence had been suppressed both by Yemeni authorities and by scholars committed to the traditional account. This is not entirely true. If you actually look in, Toby Lester doesn't know Arabic, and if you look into the press archives of the relevant Yemeni newspapers, Mr. Puin actually wrote a letter in Arabic to the Grand Mufti, one of the highest religious authorities in Yemen at the time, in which he stated in no uncertain terms that the manuscripts that had come to light had no difference from the Quran as it exists today. So maybe he lied, maybe he said that just for purposes of local consumption, and said other things when he left. He claimed that he was going to research this and make this all known to the world, but he never did. And many years went by and nothing happened. So that's Puin, but I'm really not interested in Gerhard Puin too much. But the Sana'a palimpsests, or the Sana'a manuscripts, continued to be an issue, and they are brought up to this day, especially by Christian polemicists, especially evangelical Christians on evangelical YouTube, who think that they have found sort of the ultimate weapon, so to speak, in their polemics with Muslims. And there's a lot of really heated videos. Most of them are not of a scholarly nature. A lot of these evangelical Christians who are involved in the debate really do not have the expertise in the subject. And the same applies for many of the Muslims. A lot of these guys are just out of their depth, and they're just going back and forth. And, YouTube, this medium, really thrives on controversy, name calling, reaction to reaction videos, and so forth, and is far from being a scholarly medium. At any rate, so what is really at stake here? So let's use this as a kind of entranceway to the discussion. First and foremost, I would like to make clear that people like Gerhard Puin, as well as my professor, Michael Cook at Princeton, as well as his friend and colleague who's now dead, Patricia Crone, as well as their professor and teacher at the School of Oriental and African Studies, London, John Wansborough, and others like him. But these are the main figures. The Qur'an is not, as these people think, a manuscript phenomenon. I'm going to say this again. The Qur'an is not a manuscript phenomenon. The Qur'an is an oral phenomenon. It is an oral text, O-R-A-L, meaning spoken, and it's also aural. Try to overpronounce that. A-U-R-A-L, meaning it's auditory. It's something which is spoken, it's recited, and it's heard. The word Qur'an in Arabic means to recite. And the Qur'an, in the very first instance, is always transmitted by sound, by the human voice. When Muslim children learn the Qur'an, they cannot read. I don't deny that there are, written copies of the Qur'an, but the Qur'an, in the first instance, when it's learned as a recitation. We know Muslim kids at a very early age, 2, 3 years old, they can't read this. This is a typical printed copy of the Qur'an, very widespread printed edition, printed in Saudi Arabia at the Royal Printing Complex of the Holy Qur'an. And these are sent around the world free. So a lot of people have these in their house who are Muslim, even non-Muslim. But a typical Muslim child, when they first start, they can't read this. And when Muslims pray, and Muslims pray 5 times a day, they recite passages, often very long, from the Qur'an. But they can't stand up and do this. It's not like the Jews pray, where they have this book and they rock back and forth. Muslims face in the direction of Mecca, and they recite whatever passages they recite from the Qur'an in their daily prayers. They recite them by heart. Nobody looks at a book. And it's highly encouraged to memorize the entire Qur'an by heart. It's not as difficult as it sounds. This is about 600 pages. I know that sounds very intimidating, but it would really surprise you how easy it is to memorize. And you have to remember, the vast majority of Muslims in the world don't know Arabic. And yet you will find huge numbers of people who have memorized the Qur'an in countries like the Philippines, in the Muslim part of Philippines, Mindanao, or Indonesia. You find, many, millions and millions of people who've memorized the Qur'an, people who are not Arabs, Bengalis and Indians and Pakistanis and, people from Senegal and Nigeria and of course the Arab world, Arabic speakers, people from Arabic is their native language, Egyptians and Saudis and Libyans and Iraqis and Syrians and Palestinians and so forth. So the Qur'an is first and foremost an oral text. And that is what is decisive. So Muslims, unlike with the Bible, the problem with people who make this kind of argument is that they want the story of the history of the text, so to speak, of the Quran to be the same as it is for the Bible. And for the Bible, we mean the Old and the New Testaments. Let's see. Well, here's one. Yes, this is often what happens in libraries. The books fall down and they land on you. Ouch. What a mess. There's an interesting story about Arab Muslim scholar, bibliophile back in the days in Baghdad. And he had such a huge library, he pulled a book off a shelf and the whole shelf fell on him and he died. Fortunately, that didn't happen right now. But one wonders. So if you take the Hebrew Bible, here's an edition, the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia. This is a critical edition of the Hebrew text of the Bible. And you see there's all these little footnotes at the bottom. and they are what is called a critical apparatus. And so what these scholars have done, the first person who compiled the first edition of this critical edition of the Hebrew Bible was, that would be Rudolf Kittel. I think this is an early edition. It's a German Protestant scholar. And yeah, these are published. Yeah, Rudolf Kittel. And these are published by the Deutsche Bibelgesellschaft, the I think German Bible Society. And so what they do is they take all the manuscripts of the Old Testament, as the Christians call it, and there are many of these, and then they don't really agree, they have different versions, and they give the variants in the footnotes in the bottom, what's called the critical apparatus. So even the first five books of Moses, which for the Jews is called the Torah, that is not memorized by religious Jews, and certainly not memorized by Christians. And so they don't have a tradition of recitation. The only group that is quote unquote Jewish that has a tradition of recitation are the Samaritans, the Shomronim, as they're known in Hebrew, and they're not considered to be Jews by the Jews. And they have a different Pentateuch, it's called the Samaritan Pentateuch. I have a critical edition here by Abraham Tal. And there's 6,000 different variations between that and what's called the Masoretic text. And so this is the situation. And with the New Testament, there's a critical edition of the New Testament by Nestle and Alland. That's one edition. And there's another one, another critical edition, but I don't want to get into all of these details. But all of them have these different variants, and there's these different manuscripts. And in the case of the New Testament is in Greek. And there are many, many manuscripts, and some of these manuscripts are really, really tiny. I'm not exaggerating, literally the size of a postage stamp, that have little snippets. And there's something like 125,000 different variants, if I'm not mistaken. So my point is that these guys who come from a biblical studies, a critical study of the Bible, Old and New Testaments, they want the story to be the same for the Qur'an, and that is simply not the case. Because it is an oral text, and Muslims have never, ever relied solely upon a written version. So this has to be stated at the outset. And so all of these kind of arguments where they say that, well, we found this manuscript that doesn't match what is there in the Quran today. So you have to understand that when people copy out manuscripts, sometimes they make mistakes. All right. And let's say you were copying out a page of the Quran and then you make a mistake. Well, what do you do with it? Let's say the rest of it is correct. So people would revere the written word, especially in ancient Semitic context. It's also there in a Jewish context. It's there in a Muslim context. So even now, there are people in the Muslim world who revere the written word, and they don't even like to, disrespect even a newspaper by putting it on the floor. And copies of the Quran in a Muslim house will always be kept in a high place on a high shelf, for example. This isn't a copy of the Quran. I'm just sort of showing you on a, this is a copy of the Quran. So preferably, when it's not being used or studied or what have you, will be put on a high part of the shelf. Sometimes they even cover them with a nice, maybe silk or other very nice fabric cover, or keep them in special boxes. And even when they're reading or studying the Quran, they do it in a state of sort of reverence and so forth. So the written word is revered, even if there's a mistake in it. And there are still pious Muslims today that if you have the phrase Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful, which you often have at the top of, let's say, a letter or something, and you want to throw that away, they'll tear off that part and they'll put it in a drawer somewhere. A lot of pious Muslims have a drawer for this kind of thing, and these drawers fill up after a while. And you find this situation in the Jewish community as well, a reverence for the written word. And so sometimes you'd have repositories that would be full of this kind of material. And so if you have some pages of the Quran that you've made a mistake writing, you would also put those in a place like that. And there was a very famous discovery that was made in the early part of the 20th century in a Cairo synagogue A whole huge ton of documents literally came out of the synagogues. They're known as the Cairo Geniza. Geniza is a kind of pronunciation of the word Knesset, which means synagogue in Hebrew. And in Arabic, you also have the cognate term kanisa, meaning church in Christian Arabic. At any rate, and they found all these documents there because you had pious Jews who revered the written word and they didn't want to throw things away. So it turns out this became very important for historical documents. So I would argue this is the situation we have in Sana'a as well. So you have a bunch of various manuscripts. And moreover, you're saying that there was something written underneath and people washed it off and erased it. Well, maybe they did that because it was wrong. And now you're taking the erasure and saying that this is what the Quran actually was. Well, this is a ridiculous argument because in the first instance, Muslims don't even consider, strictly speaking, that to be the Quran. The Quran is a recitation. So even here, strictly speaking, this isn't the Quran. What we have is a modern form of the Arabic script, which is a visual representation of what the Quran is. And so, it's not a particular page that says, whatever it says, God is the light of the heavens and the earth. That's not Quran. That's also a translation. Quran is Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Allahu nuru samawati wal ard mathalu nurihi kamishkatin fiha misbah al misbahu fi zujaja az-zujajatu kannaha kawkabun durriyyun yuqadu min shajaratin mubarakatin zaytunatin la sharqiyyatin wala gharbiyya yakadu zaytuha yudhi'u lahu lam tamsashu nar nurun ala nur yahdillahu li nurihi man yasha wa yadribu Allahu al-amthala lin-nas, etc. That's Quran. Allah is the light of the heavens and the earth. The similitude of his light is like a niche wherein is a lamp, etc., etc., etc. is the translation of that. Very famous verse from the Quran. So even I can recite large portions of the Quran like that from memory. That is what the Quran is. And these guys, the sooner they understand that, the better. It's not a manuscript phenomenon. Anyway, having said all that, then what is the actual history or transmission history of the Quran as a written text? That is an important and interesting question, and you won't find it in Daniel Brown, and you won't find it in Toby Lester's article. The whole point of Toby Lester's 1999 article was to raise doubts about the authenticity of the Quran as we have it today. All right, so although I'm saying that the Quran is an oral phenomenon, there are written copies of the Quran. So how do we get to this written copy of the Quran right now in 1444 of the Hijrah, 2023, from the year, not even one of the Hijrah, but 13 years before the Hijrah. The Prophet's Muhammad's mission in Mecca would last 13 years, 10 years in Medina, 23 years, and even those years are lunar years, which is somewhat shorter than the solar years. So it's more like 22 years if you put them in solar years. Anyway, so what actually happened? So first of all, you have to understand that the Quran, again, is an oral text. The word Quran means recitation. And the revelation of the Quran took place over that 23 lunar year period, piecemeal, in parts. The Quran was not revealed all at once into the heart of the Prophet Muhammad and then immediately communicated to the world. The actual text as it was communicated to human beings was revealed piecemeal, in parts. And the first revelation, chronologically, are the opening lines of what is the 96th surah. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq khalaqal insana min 'alaq. Iqra wa rabbukal akram alladhi 'allama bil qalam 'allama al insana ma lam ya'lam. So the 96th surah of the Quran, it opens with those verses which says, in the name of Allah, the infinitely compassionate, the merciful, recite in the name of your Lord who created man from a clinging fluid. Recite, and your Lord is most generous or bounteous. Who taught man by means of the pen, taught man that which he knew not. Those are the opening verses of the Quran, chronologically speaking. They were revealed to the Prophet Muhammad in his retreat or in a state of seclusion on the Mount of Hira, which is outside of Mecca, and it can still be seen today in a cave of Hira on the mountain, Jabal al-Nur. Sorry, the name of the mountain is Mount Nur, as it's known, the mountain of light. So that is the first part of the Quran to be revealed. Notice I said it's in the 96th surah. So these revelations piecemeal over time are not ordered in the Quran in chronological order. The first chapter of the Quran, the first surah, is actually 7 verses long. It's Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Maliki Yawmiddin, Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in, ihdina as-sirata al-mustaqim, sirata alladhina an'amta alayhim ghayril maghdubi alayhim waladdallin. Every Muslim knows that by heart because you have to recite it in every prayer. So it's in the name of Allah, the infinitely compassionate, the merciful, all praises due to Allah, Lord of the worlds, and so on. That's what is at the beginning of the Quran. Then this is followed by the longest surah in the Quran, which is the second surah, Suratul Baqarah. Generally, the surahs in the Quran, and there are 114 of them, are arranged according more or less to their length, not according to any other principle of organization. So the second surah of the Quran, Surah Al-Baqarah, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Alif Lam Mim, ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ هُدًى لِلْمُتَّقِينَ الَّذِينَ يُؤْمِنُونَ بِالْغَيْبِ وَيُقِيمُونَ الصَّلَاةَ وَمِمَّا رَزَقْنَاهُمْ يُنْفِقُونَ, etc. It's very long, 286 verses. Surah Al-Fatiha, the opening, the first chapter is only 7 verses. And what was the last verse of the Quran to be revealed chronologically? It was revealed in the very last days of the Prophet during the final pilgrimage to Mecca, some months before he died, and that was Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, al-Yawma akmaltu lakum dinakum wa raditu lakum al-Islam dina. I think it's al-Yawma akmaltu lakum dinakum wa atmamtu alaykum ni'mati wa raditu lakum al-Islam dina. I think it is, yeah. This day have I perfected you your religion and completed my favor upon you and chosen Islam for you as your religion. So the point is that the Quran is revealed in a piecemeal fashion, and this is going on for 23 years. And the Prophet Muhammad, what he did was that he instituted a kind of literacy program, because literacy and writing was not widespread. There was no standard way of writing Arabic letters or words. There were differences. So if you know about Arabic, Arabic has as many letters that have the same shape when they're written separately, and they're distinguished by dots above and below. And originally Arabic wasn't written that way. So here's an example. This is a calligraphic panel. I don't know if you can see it. Man, this is just too big. It shows sort of the development. It's backwards here. So early forms of Arabic are like this. They don't have any dots, and the letters are kind of primitive. And then you get a more advanced form that comes much later. So the early forms of the Arabic writing system were not standardized in terms of their shapes and whether you put dots in or not. But primitive as the system was, the Prophet Muhammad encouraged people to learn the rudiments, as it were, at that time of writing. And in fact, in the Battle of Badr, there were some prisoners that were taken. And when prisoners were taken who were literate, the Prophet Muhammad said that they would be amnestied and set free if they would teach 10 Muslim children the art of writing as it existed at that time, reading and writing. And so when verses were revealed from the Quran, the Prophet would memorize them. The Muslim belief is that the angel Gabriel would come sometimes in a human form and sometimes in a form that nobody could see or experience but the Prophet Muhammad, and the revelation would come to him and he would be taught these verses until they were impressed, as he described it, onto his heart, and he remembered them. Then he would transmit these to his close companions, and then the ones who could write, he instructed them to write things down. You think they had piles of notebook paper, they had a Staples in Medina and they all went there? No, there was very, very rudimentary writing materials, not even parchment, as I talked about. And a lot of times they would take whatever was available. So they might take even some sort of a flat stone, because in that part of Arabia, in the Hijaz, there's a lot of rocks in abundance. So you find some sort of a flat stone, and they would write using some sort of rudimentary pigment on that stone surface. Bones were also available, especially camel bones and they would use the shoulder blades of camels, and they would write bits of the revelation. So how much of a surah you think you're going to fit on the shoulder blade of a camel? I've seen camel shoulder blades. They're not that big. In fact, I have a camel shoulder blade in my manuscript collection. You might think that is very strange, but it's modern. It's from North Africa, Libya, I believe. In fact, it was given to me as a gift by my professor of Syriac at Princeton University, Professor Jonathan Marks. And it's about yay long, and the shoulder blade part is about this wide. So, depending on how big or small you write, you're not going to be able to fit a lot on there. So they wrote down whatever they could. And then these pieces were sort of in circulation. And so it is a well-known fact that when the Prophet Muhammad died, the hadith sources, the historical sources on this indicate that the Prophet Muhammad died, and then it says, wal Qur'an lam yujma', and the Qur'an was not gathered together. However, many Orientalists, when they translate that, they say the Qur'an wasn't written down, and that's not correct. The verb there is yujma'. It's in the passive form. It means to be collected. In other words, there were various written materials of a very rudimentary, primitive, even nature, shoulder blades, rocks, and then there were people, papyrus was available from Egypt. And we know that there were a number of companions of the Prophet Muhammad who had written materials of the Qur'an in their possession. So let's say you've got a bunch of these disparate materials, maybe you wrap them up in a cloth. And again, there's not a lot of cloth and other things available. One of the materials or textiles that things were made of and was, there in abundance was camel hair. So people had camel hair cloaks. You'd have a light one for the summer, heavy one for the winter. People in Arabian countries, especially Bedouins, still wear these. In Iraq, you will still find this. Even in, the fancy Gulf countries, Dubai. Well, Dubai is not a country. United Arab Emirates. Dubai is one of the Emirates in the UAE. Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, you can still get these kind of things. And people still wear them. And, if you're out in the desert, they're very, very practical. So they might wrap things up like this. And even if they had some sort of, let's say, parchment, binding was not easy. So you see, like, this is a book, and it has a binding. And a bound book in English from the Latin is called a codex. So many of these early Qur'ans in the centuries that came after, immediately after the first and second centuries of the Hijrah, when people would actually have complete written copies of the Qur'an in parchment, they weren't bound. They would often be wrapped in leather, in a kind of a leather cover, and then you'd open them and you'd have these individual pieces. And so they can get lost. And a lot of the early manuscripts of the Qur'an are incomplete for this reason, because they weren't bound, and you have these little leaves floating around. And some old Qur'ans, you have like pieces of them in, let's say, in the Bibliothèque Nationale in France. That's a very famous manuscript collection. You might have another piece of the same because they can identify through the size and the parchment and the style of the writing. You might have another piece of that in the Princeton University Library, for example, or somewhere in Britain in British Library, for example. So it was a very sort of primitive situation. So when did they start writing this down? Well, according to Shīʿah hadith traditions, this is not there in Sunni traditions, but in, excuse me, in Shīʿah hadith collection known as Bihar al-Anwar, it says that according to the sixth Shiite Imam Jafar al-Sadiq, that the Prophet Muhammad one day said to, before his death, near his, just prior to his death, this is when this should have happened, said to Ali, who's the first Shiite Imam, he said, "Oh Ali, يا علي القرآن خلف فراشي في المصحف والحرير والقراطيس فخذوه ولا تضيعوه كما ضيعت اليهود التوراة." So he says, "Oh Ali, the Quran is right there, as it were, behind my bed, kind of wooden bed frame, in sort of unbound leaves and on Harir, it means silk. Qaratis is an Arabic word, which here in this context would mean sort of individual sort of leaves or pages. And he says, take it and do not lose it. Do not let it be lost as the Jews lost the Torah. This is the text. Then it says, فَانْطَلَقَ عَلِيٌّ فَجَمَعَهُ فِي ثَوْبٍ أَخْضَرٍ. Then Ali went, collected together these disparate materials, and put them in a green cloth. ثُمَّ خَتَمَ عَلَيْهِ فِي بَيْتِهِ. And then he sealed it up in his house. And then he said, وَقَالَ لَا أَرْتَدِي حَتَّى أَجْمَعَهُ. He said that I won't, put on my outer garment like a jacket, but it actually means a cloak here, and go outside, because, properly dressed man wouldn't leave the house without a cloak. He said, I'm not even going to put on my cloak and go out of the house until I have collected together all these materials. And it's a known fact that Imam Ali, the first Shiite Imam after the death of the Prophet and whatever happened, he really refused to go out of his house except to attend the prayers, public congregational prayers, until he had compiled a personal copy in a written form of the Qur'an. And he was a known person who knew how to read and write. He was one of the scribes of the Qur'an. So the people who were literate in the time of the Prophet also became scribes of the Qur'an and wrote on these disparate kind of materials. That's the Shiite understanding of things. The Sunni understanding is that there was no such collection done by the Prophet, and that what actually happened was that there was, in the time of the first Sunni Khalifa, Abu Bakr, an unfortunate reality came to light, namely that many of the people who had the Qur'an memorized by heart had died in a battle, especially in a battle known as the Battle of Yamama. And to make a long story short, Omar, who was a close advisor of Abu Bakr and succeeded him as the second caliph of the Sunni Muslims, urged Abu Bakr to take some action and to produce a written version of the Qur'an. So you have to understand, again, there was no really standard written form of the Arabic language in terms of the alphabet and the letters and the dotting and the sizes and the shapes. And so this was a very audacious undertaking, and something which hadn't been done in the time of the Prophet, and people were relying completely on their memory. And so Abu Bakr then sent for someone named Zayd ibn Thabit. Now, Zayd ibn Thabit is an important figure. Zayd ibn Thabit was a young man at the time, and he said, you're a young guy, this is something that you can do. Why don't you go and collect together every sort of written scrap of the Qur'an that people have, and let's produce a written version of the Qur'an. Why Zayd ibn Thabit? Zayd ibn Thabit was linguistically accomplished. The Prophet Muhammad had actually ordered him to learn Hebrew, and in some versions also said to learn Syriac. Excuse me. And I think that the reason he did this was to learn, about a writing system of a similar Semitic language, to see, what could be done. But, that's just my interpretation. You don't have to agree with me. I'm sure there are people who wouldn't accept that, but I think it's interesting. I think it's a very interesting fact that Zayd was chosen by Abu Bakr to do this, given his facility with languages. Because a lot of Muslims today, when they hear this, what's the big deal? They knew the Quran by heart. All you have to do is sit down, write it down. Like, I could do it right now, or somebody could do it right. We could sit down, take a long while, but you could write, if you have the Quran memorized by heart, you could write it down. So why didn't they do that? They're just sit down and do it. Why did they have to search for all these other written fragments? The reason is because there was no standard way of writing Arabic. And again, this is something which isn't said in those accounts because it's understood. Written texts have a context. If you don't understand the context, you're in trouble. And I think a lot of people have read these historical accounts through modern lenses and not really understood. And I think on the part of the Orientalists and many of the missionaries and people who come with this kind of agenda, who study Islam, obviously have their agenda, and they want to make certain polemical points. But if one looks at this from a more dispassionate angle or lens, you can understand that there was no comparable written text. The Qur'an, in fact, is the first complete Arabic text to take the form of a bound book. There was nothing before it in the Arabic language. And so all these materials are collected together, and some sort of a rough version is supposed to have been put together. Or these materials were gathered together, but then I don't think anything really was done thereafter. And this account that I'm paraphrasing here is in the famous Sunni source known as Bukhari, Sahih al-Bukhari. So these materials were there in the possession of Abu Bakr, and some people argue that a version was made. If a version was made, it wasn't a sort of public version, it was just some sort of a draft version, presumably. And then after the death of Abu Bakr at the end of his reign, it appears that, and this is in the commentary on Bukhari called Fathul Bari, that Umar ibn al-Khattab had a copy also made on the basis of those materials, which was then deposited with his daughter Hafsa. So it's not really until the third caliph of the Sunni Muslims, namely Uthman ibn Affan. And just to give you some perspective, Abu Bakr only was there for just about 2 years. So he dies in the year 13 of the Hijrah. Then you've got Umar ibn al-Khattab. He's from 13 to about year 23 of the Hijrah. And then from about that time until the year 35 or so of the Hijrah, you've got Uthman ibn Affan. And so there, the task is revisited with somewhat more urgency, again, for the same sort of reason, the death of people who had the Qur'an by heart. And also, according to a report, the emergence of a disagreement on the recitation of the Qur'an. And so once again, Zayd ibn Thabit is charged with this task. These materials are there. The gathered materials are, checked again, and then a kind of standard written copy of the Qur'an is set down, and it is called Al-Mushaf al-Imam, the master copy, which was to be kept in Medina. And then other copies were made. In some versions, it's 7, 8, 9, 11 different copies of that master copy are made and then sent out to what were called the Amsar, or the frontier garrison cities in the expanding Islamic empire. And many Muslims claim that some of these copies still survive. There's one in the mosque of Sayyidina al-Hussein in Cairo. They claim it goes back to the days of Uthman. There's one also which is in Samarkand, and in the case of the Samarkand copy, I have a facsimile of this somewhere. Where did it go? Anyway, the Samarkand copy is there, and a facsimile of it has been made, and you can actually look at. I have a copy of it, much reduced because it's very large, but I have a much reduced copy of the entire thing. It's not complete, so the pages at the beginning and the pages at the end are missing, and that's typically what happens even with a bound book. If the binding breaks, where does it break? Usually it doesn't break in the middle. It breaks at the beginning, it breaks at the end, and so the pages from the beginning fall out, and pages from the end fall out. And there's also damage inside some of and this would be on parchment. Parchment is torn in places, not clear. Maybe there was water damage, humidity, any number of things. And if you actually look at that, there's no sort of insane sort of variance and so forth. And if you know how to read ancient Arabic without the dots, you can read it. You can figure it out. There's other manuscripts that have come to light. For example, there's one in Birmingham, UK. Some people claim that this is within maybe 10 years of the death of the Prophet. Very hard to know. These kind of datings are very, conjectural, but the writing script, the style of the written script is very, very primitive, very old, but it's very readable. If you actually go online and type in Birmingham Qur'an, you can get images. And if you know Arabic, you can easily read, like it's Surah Taha, Inna al-Qur'ana, etc. Actually, yeah. Anyway, you can go and search for it, and if you can read Arabic, you can read that quite clearly. So I think a lot of fuss has been made about this, quite unjustifiably, because even if you find manuscripts purportedly of the Quran that have mistakes, from, or in the sense that they don't match what we have today. Again, you don't have any context for this page. So yes, if there's a mistake and the person discarded it and now it's survived, and you say, oh, well, that doesn't tell you anything about what the person thought about that page which they have transcribed. So to say that, oh, there was some ancient manuscript, which we found, and it was it's a palimpsest, and we use some special spectrum of light and we can read, and it doesn't agree with the Quran there. What does that really establish? Especially in as much as the Muslims never have considered the Quran to be a written text in the first instance. And the way that Arabic is written today, that's a development over time. There's all sorts of marks that go above and below Arabic letters to indicate how they're pronounced, because in Arabic, especially the short vowels are never written. It's only long vowels that are sometimes written, and the short vowels aren't there. And there's some letter shapes which aren't distinguishable from the others unless there are certain dots. And so the system of dots and all of these things comes around later, and it's really solidified by the time of the death of a famous Arabic linguistic scholar by the name of Al-Khalil ibn Ahmad al-Farahidi, and he died around the year 170. And before him, a rudimentary system of dots was introduced, but then it was left, and then people took up his system. So that system has been with us for a very, very long time. The way of writing Arabic has improved over time. It's become a very standard in terms of letter shapes and calligraphy, and this all developed over time. And so today what we have is a system of visual symbols, which not only tells us how to recite the Quran, how to read it, but how to recite it. So, for example, there's one chapter of the Quran which is called Surah Yasin. It's the 36th chapter of the Quran. It's called the heart of the Quran, Qalbul Quran. So if you just read it, it would be Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Yasin wal Qur'an al-Hakim, innaka lamin al-mursalin ala siratal mustaqim, tanzil al-aziz al-rahim, litundira qawman ma undira aba'uhum fahum ghafilun. But that's not how the Quran is recited. There is a way of reciting the Quran, and that you cannot learn just from the symbols. There are symbols here that help you, but you can't know what they mean unless someone teaches it to you. So the way that it's supposed to be done is Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Yasin, wal Qur'anil Hakim, إنك لمن المرسلين على صراط مستقيم. Now, I'm not very good, but there are very accomplished Qur'an reciters. And so there's all sorts of, shall we say, vocal embellishments that go into this. And some letters are elongated and some things are shortened. And so there's a whole sort of, shall we say, musicality, although we wouldn't really consider this as music, but there is a musicality to it. And then there is even a musical mode called a maqam. I'm really not very good at it, but there are different maqams or musical modes for the recitation of the Quran. So there's things like maqam nahawand, rast, bayati, and so forth. And you can actually go on YouTube, type in Quran maqams, M-A-Q-A-M, and you'll find all sorts of people, showing you how this is done. So the Quran is an oral text, and there is a whole tradition of oral science of recitation of the Quran. And then there are also oral variations, which actually vary the words sometimes. And that is also part of the tradition. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ indicated that there is a plurality of ways, some of which reflect dialect in ancient times for the recitation of the Quran. And it's a famous hadith saying that the Quran was revealed according to 7 modes or 7 ways of recitation. And the word that's used in Arabic is harf, and some people translate that as letter, but I don't think that is really adequately conveys the meaning. Moreover, the number 7 is a kind of symbolic number in Arabic that generally denotes plurality. So there is a plurality of means and methods of reciting the Quran. And so, for example, in the first surah, there's a verse which says most people, in the majority of Muslims in the world, will recite it as Maliki Yawmiddin. Maliki Yawmiddin. Okay? And that is one way of reciting, and that is the recitation or the reading of Asim in the riwayah or the transmission of someone named Hafs. So these have names attached to the people who transmitted them. And that's how most people in the Muslim world would recite that verse. But in North Africa, so that's, I would say, definitely Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria, if I'm not mistaken, maybe Libya as well, it would be recited different. It would not be Maliki Yawmiddin. It would be Maliki Yawmiddin. So here's the difference. Maliki, 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 and Maliki. Malik means owner, Malik means king, but both readings or both ways of reciting have the stamp of the Muslim tradition by the Prophet ﷺ, indicating that the Quran can be recited this way, and these go back to him. So there are lots of examples of that. That was very obvious, but then there are other sort of subtle differences, like there's a famous word in Arabic which occurs a lot in the Quran, which means it's a pronoun. A lot of interest in pronouns nowadays. Is it a pronoun? Actually, I think it's a demonstrative. It means, I know it would be a pronoun. Yeah, no, it's a pronoun. I think it's, the word is in Arabic is ulaika. So ulaika is they. Yeah, it's a pronoun. It's a form of a pronoun which means they in Arabic. So you, depending on where it is in the Quran, it's either ulaika or ulaika. It's written the same way, but the sound is different. How do you know that? Again, it's an oral text. So I mean, I say this in so many classes, and I've pointed this out to so many people, yet still you have, I've even done videos on this because there's so much on YouTube by Christian polemicists trying to, say, make some sort of point that there's all these different versions of the Quran. There's not. There's one Quran. The Quran is an oral text, and there's different ways recognized by the tradition of reciting it. So I think all of that has to be borne in mind when studying the Quran. So I just wanted to give you some examples of that. The rest of what's actually there in the book is pretty straightforward. You can read it. If you're interested in these different sort of Quranic manuscripts, if you can read a little bit of Arabic, you can. You don't even have to know Arabic. If you know how to read the modern, the modern transcription of the Arabic language in contemporary Qurans that is floating or that are in circulation around the world, you can usually, if you know what surah it is, figure it out. The ancient form of the script is often called Kufic, in reference to the ancient Arab garrison town of Kufa, which was established in the Islamic period, but it really has nothing to do with Kufa because these manuscripts are older than Kufa, or that form of writing. And so some people have come up with the word Hijazi in reference to the Hijaz, the coastal plain where Mecca and Medina are, to refer to this ancient kind of script. And some forms of this ancient script are written kind of slanted, like an italic or at an angle. And so some people have called this form of writing al-khattul ma'il. Ma'il just means diagonal. So, what they actually called this script, we don't know. They just called it khat, writing script. And you also find a lot of sort of rock carvings and so forth that have this kind of ancient way of writing the Arabic language. You also find many sort of rock carvings also that have verses from the Quran from ancient times. Daniel Brown tries to make it appear that there are some Qur'an inscriptions from the Quran inside the Dome of the Rock in Al-Quds al-Sharif in Jerusalem, and that there's some sort of variant way of doing it. This is completely wrong. I actually haven't been there, but there are photos, and in fact, there's an entire book on the Dome of the Rock. And you can, I've seen, I don't own this book, it's an expensive book, and they've taken, it's an octagonal structure, and there's verses that go around, there's writing that goes around, and you can read the whole writing, and they're claiming that there's some different version of the Qur'an that's quoted there. What happened is that during the Umayyad dynasty, the Umayyad ruler responsible for this structure inscribed a statement there in which he quotes from the Qur'an, and it's completely normal to, especially in eloquent Arabic discourse, to incorporate snippets from the Qur'an as quotations, what's called an iqtibas in Arabic, into your own discourse. And it's done constantly, especially in eloquent sort of high-level Arabic, classical Arabic speeches and oratory, like the Jummah khutbah or the Friday sermon is often done. So, for example, if you go to the, let's say let's go to Surah al, excuse me, just a second. Surah al-Isra, which is the 17th surah, so it's on page 282 here. So, yeah, the 17th surah of the Quran, the first verse says, I'm just going to read this without vocal embellishment. It says, Subhana alladhi asra bi'abdihi layla min al-masjid al-harami lil-masjid al-aqsa. Okay, so if somebody wants to give a speech, a religious sermon, for example, that has something to do with Jerusalem, or has something to do with the Isra, and Mi'raj, the ascent and night journey of the Prophet Muhammad, he might begin, because every sermon has to begin after the formula Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, has to begin with the praise of God by saying Alhamdulillah. So the khatib or the orator might say, Alhamdulillah alladhi asra bi'abdihi laylan min al-masjid al-haram ila al-masjid al-aqsa, and then he'll stop there. Then the next sentence will rhyme with that in a rhymed prose. That's an iqtibas. That's a quotation from the Quran. Instead of Subhanallah, he said Alhamdulillah, but the rest of it is from the Quran. And the listeners who are aware of the Quran and who have memorized the Quran, have lived with the Quran since they were children, will know what he is doing. But the Orientalists who went to go and read the inscription in the Dome of the Rock didn't know this, and so they claim that there's some variant version of the Quran invented by Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan in his inscription in the Dome of the Rock. So this is just stupidity, plain and simple. And people just having an agenda, trying to, pass off these egregious errors as some sort of scholarship. And anyhow, I will leave it at that. And you can easily read the, whatever is there in the chapter. But what I'm trying in these lectures is to give you information which is not entirely there in the textbook. I do hope that you found this to be useful. Thank you very much for watching.